a Manousso Musing with Dr. Michael Leach. That is our topic for today. Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast by InstantMediations.com, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube, the Instant Mediations app, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact-dependent. Hi, everyone. This is attorney Mac Pierre-Louis. Welcome to Manousso Musing with seasoned mediator trainer, Dr. Barbara Manousso. This is Mac Pierre-Louis, attorney, mediator, arbitrator, working throughout Florida and Texas.
And Natalia Łuska-Czajka, advocate, mediator, and arbitrator from Warsaw, Poland, but also in Texas and Florida.
And I'm Dr. Barbara Manousso, and I am in Rhode Island and in Texas, but we work worldwide. So I'm just delighted today to have as our guest a veteran of the mediation community and one who helps and has helped families for years. Welcome, Dr. Michael Leach. And Dr. Leach is in Ohio. He has been a clinical psychologist and forensic psychologist. He works in many areas of helping families. And we've invited Dr. Leach today to talk about what a mediator's team benefits from, the resources, the type of people that might be at the table, the reports that might be needed, anything that will aid and to help in the opportunity for the best interest of the children. So Dr. Leach, welcome. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you. Glad to be here. You know, when you talk about a team, when I started doing this kind of mediation practice, what usually happened was a couple decided on their own that they wanted to go see a mediator. They didn't contact attorneys, and the mediations were pretty simple. That doesn't happen much today. I mean, it happens a little bit. You love it when they come in and they are, they're new to the whole process and they really want to get things done. But what often happens today is they go to attorneys. The attorneys get to a certain point in the process. People start to see how long that process is taking, how difficult that process is taking, and how much money that process is taking. And then at some point, either the attorney suggests or the hearing officer suggests that they start mediation. And at that point, the attorneys are part of the process. I think any mediator that gets a referral from a court needs to talk to the attorneys. And what I do, and what I always do, is I always say to the attorney, so how do you think this is going to work out? What I'm trying to get at is, did you, attorney, give the message to your client, don't come to any conclusions in this mediation process. Instead, just go in and let the other side show their hand. Let's find out what they really want. And then we can be, you're going to be a little spy in that midst. So hopefully that isn't the case. A lot of attorneys will tell you how's it going to work out, and they're going to tell you what the hot buttons are for their clients. Particularly if you have, go ahead.
Dr. Leach, we really appreciate that. The role that the attorneys will play when the parties are represented, and your work over the years as a clinical psychologist for the families, and you've also worked as an evaluator, and you've worked so closely and as a mediator. I didn't say that, and I should have. Not only a clinical psychologist, but a mediator. Yep. Talk about what these roles are, what the services are that you have worked with or helped the parties presenting their information that they bring to the mediation table or to their divorce in general. What are the roles, and maybe describe them a little bit so that a mediator would understand how they could best use the information that is brought to them.
Okay, so one role that psychologists do, and we're doing more of this these days, particularly with young children, is we are meeting with the children and their parents and coming up with a personalized plan that seems to work for them on how to manage these young children and how to transition these children later on to a plan that more meets their developmental needs. So the developmental needs of a toddler is so different than the developmental needs of a 10-year-old, and so different than the ones of a 16-year-old. And what we want is ideally a plan that changes over time with the needs of the children changing over time. You know, these static plans where you have a certain kind of parent that looks at the paper and wants everything to be the way the paper was when they signed those papers back in 1973. We don't want that sort of thing. What we want is a plan that continues to grow as the parents grow and the children grow and the relationship between the parents and the children become optimal. So one way that psychologists do it is we get referrals, and it isn't only us. There are clinical social workers and clinical counselors who are trained and experienced in putting together personalized parenting plans. And this is very useful for a mediator, because the mediator now no longer has to, it's sometimes difficult when you have parents that come in with their notions of what the plan should be, and they think about 2 inches ahead of their nose. You know, but they don't think, well, what's going to happen when this young child goes to school? What's going to happen when this young child goes and transitions from elementary school to other kinds of schooling?
So let me ask you a question, Dr. Leach, at this stage. Does it mean that this parenting plan that you're thinking with the parties, with the children, is like optional, or has certain variations or certain time divisions? Like, okay, until the child is 3, we do that. When the child is 7, we start having alternating weeks or something?
We can do that. And that's one way to set up a plan. And with some families that really need everything to be prescripted for them, that's the way to do it. But what I find is that a lot of the work of mediation is training the parents to take over the job of parenting, even though the family is now split. And what that means is that we do a short-term plan that's going to work for them now, and then leave it up to them to develop the long-term plans, knowing that they have the mediator if they have to go back in 3 years or 5 years to do more planning, to do future planning. So unless I have a couple that need the prescription and need to know what's going to happen in the future specifically, I don't like those kinds of plans. I'd much rather, because things change, the world changes, and you need to be able to respond to change.
Yes, Dr. Leach.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned therapists mediators might work with. You've mentioned attorneys mediators might work with.
Yes.
Who else do you typically see in your mediation dealing with family? Would mediators be working with?
Well, again, because most of these cases come in, at least in my experience, while the court process is going on, which is very peculiar. You know, you're trying to tell somebody to drive right and drive left at the same time. We have guardians ad litem, and these guardians are generally, at least in my area, attorneys, and some other places they may have other kinds of professional identities, but they're attorneys who are looking out both for the best interest of the child, and, at least in my area, they're also representing the child's wishes, which often has contradictions. What the child wants and what's best for them is not always the same. But guardians can be really helpful, because most mediators are never going to see these children. They're going to see the parents. Mm-hmm. And so the guardian can give them the kind of information they need about who are these unique individuals who are these kids that we're talking about, and what are their needs. And a good guardian, goes out and meets with these kids and gets a really good sense of who they are and what their needs are, and what their needs are going to be likely to be later on. And particularly with kids with special needs, for whatever reason. Right now in my caseload, I've got 3 cases where we have kids that are on the autistic spectrum. And each one of them are very different from one another. So it's a challenge, and that's helpful. Children's therapists are helpful. And one of the things that mediators sometimes like to lead into at the beginning of mediation with couples is, how did you find the therapist? And is this therapist working for your child? I often find that one or the other parent found the therapist, and the other parent didn't hear about it until the litigation process started. And that parent might think this therapist is on the side of the other parent. What we want to do is make sure that if there's a therapist for the child, that therapist, number one, stays in the picture and does the job. I often say that therapy is kind of like a roller coaster. It's safe to get on and off at the beginning of the ride. It's safe to get on and off at the end of the ride. You don't want them getting off in the middle of the ride. Yep. It's not good for kids. And so very often, the lead into a good mediation may be to talk about the child's therapist and whether we need to keep the therapist or change the therapist. But if we do change the therapist, let's make sure this therapist is acceptable to both parents, has contact with both parents, and can do the job for the kids. And let the parents know also, a good child therapist isn't going to blab about what the child is telling them. They're going to keep the child safe, but they're not going to be talking a lot to the parents about every little detail. They're not going to be the conduit of information to the parents. The parents will be the conduit of information to the therapist. The other part of the therapy side is the therapist that works for the parents. There was a book in a few years back about divorce, and the book was titled Crazy Time. We look at it and we say that usually the people we work with are good people at their worst. But they're good people at their craziest. There's no way to go through a divorce without being a little bit crazed by the process. Certainly the court process does enough to make you crazy. And just the difficulty of separation causes enormous stress on individuals. What we want is a stable environment as much as possible for the individual and the child. And we want a warm environment, which is what people lose sight of in the course of divorce.
Dr. Leach,
yes.
That's all excellent information, and it's very good for mediators to be mindful of who's at their table and the stress that the family, it's a family issue. When you mention evaluators and ad litem, how do those roles differ? What would you inform a mediator so they understand the difference? And I'm going to add a second part to the question. I'm a collaborative mediator, and I often will bring in maybe a finance person, maybe a psychologist at the mediation for the right out of the chute. I don't wait for it to be court ordered or anything. I think sometimes it's helpful when these parties can be at the table and both parents hear all the information at once. They don't feel like somebody's ganging up or undermining their authority or their relationship with a child. So I happen to like to bring them in right up front, and I'll ask the family, would you like to bring in so-and-so? And they'll sit for an hour, provide information they need, Then they can leave if they like, or they can stay, and then the parents have an opportunity to discuss the issue that might stem from it. So with that being said, how would you inform the mediator so they understand what the difference in role is between an evaluator and an ad litem?
Okay, so the guardian ad litem is free to use whatever process that they feel is reasonable to understand the child and the child's needs. The guardian ad litem typically is an attorney, so they're trained in looking at the various different legal requirements for child custody, for shared parenting, or for sole custody. And they'll go through those. Very often in the guardian's report, we will see, the statute being quoted, and then here's how these people meet the statutory requirements. I was talking with a guardian earlier this week, and I said to him, I said, one of the problems that I have as a psychological evaluator is we're looking to find fault with everybody. That's our job. Our job is to do, in my case, psychological testing, and a lot of, we look at the allegations made by both parents, and some of these allegations are false. In fact, many years ago, you might find this interesting, myself and two other colleagues did a study of 45 cases in which there were allegations of alcohol or drug abuse. And in those 45 cases, we only found one of the 45 cases where there was actually any kind of objective support for the allegation of alcohol or drug abuse. People tend in the middle of divorce to talk about, back 5 years ago at Christmas time, he got drunk, and therefore he's an alcoholic. We want to get rid of that kind of thing. So the psychologist will often, at least in my area, we will actually give the court information, a lot of detailed information that comes from the parents and our observations of the children, and our contacts with all kinds of other people that might be involved with the children, like doctors, teachers, administrators, coaches, people like that. And then we'll give our opinion, which may or may not differ from the opinions of the guardian, because we use a different way of gathering data. And so the mediator needs to know that neither of our opinions are the gold standard. Neither my opinion or the opinions of the guardian ad litem. This is more information that they can use to try to understand the family that's in front of them.
So Dr. Leach, just to be clear, are we talking about that you're, as an evaluator, are you evaluating the parents, or are you evaluating the child? Or an ad litem, they're just representing the children, correct?
Right. The ad litem is representing the children and the interests of the children. Now, they will talk with the parents, and they'll get a sense of the family situation.
Absolutely.
My job, I have to do a 360 evaluation. When I do an evaluation, I have to look at the parents, I have to look at the children. It is my belief that a good evaluation requires me to talk to, or at least look at, everyone in the household.
Okay.
I can think of a case where I didn't do that, where I had a 85-year-old grandmother who only spoke Chinese. I decided not to talk to her. But the others, you want to know who is in the household. You even want to know who the stepchildren are, or the children that come over just for the weekends. In a case we just settled this last couple of weeks, I hope we settled it. We had to put together a parenting plan that echoed the plan of the 16-year-old boy who visits on weekends and one night a week, because these kids were the younger kids, the 5-year-old and the 7-year-old, was so tied to their half brother that That was, in fact, they were more tied, I think, to their half brother than they were to their dad at this point, who was pretty much out of the picture for a while. That having that in the household and having the exact same times that he's there with them makes stability for their household. So we use a different format for developing our conclusions than does the guardian ad litem. Is that format better? It's no better. It's just different source of information which the mediator can have.
And when we speak about that, Dr. Leach, I wanted to ask you.
Let me just say this before we go on, because one other thing that always troubles people in our reports, we report everything that somebody alleges, whether it's true or not. We don't say, essentially, we're not going to report this or we're not going to report that. So a mediator needs to look at these reports carefully and say, well, these are just allegations. These are not things that have been absolutely proven to be true. Sorry, I cut you off.
That's fine. I just wanted to ask you, but you wear those two hats, either an expert or the mediator. When you are the mediator, are you seeing the kids too? This is the controversial issue, the role of the children in mediation. And from your psychological neuroscience knowledge, what would you say? Should the child be a part of the mediation? And if yes, to which extent and upon which grounds?
I don't have a clear picture of how I do it. There are times where I will, there are times where I won't. It sort of depends on the feel I have for what this family might need. I can tell you, when you mentioned that, I thought of this little girl that I saw years ago. She was 7 years old, and I did see her as part of the mediation picture. And she said, I want shared parenting. 7. And I said, what does that mean to you, Melissa? And she said, I want shared parenting just like Susie down the street has. What does Susie have? Every other weekend and one night a week. Well, you know, I don't know that she had all that much to offer to the situation, but she was very clear that what was good for her would be a plan that was good for her neighbors. And that was relayed to the parents, that this is a child who wants to fit in her neighborhood. Do I do it all the time? No, I don't. And I know it is a controversial issue. Should we involve the children? When I do custody evaluations, it's the absolute reverse. I spend a lot of time with the kids trying to find out two things. Number one, how much have they been pushed and pulled by parents to say things? I usually, with anybody 8 years old or under, I usually end my interviews at the door saying, oh, make sure you tell me everything you're supposed to tell me now, so that they have a chance to tell me what they've been told to tell me.
I see. I see. Well, that's very interesting.
With older kids, I want to hear what they have to say.
Well, Dr. Leach, this has been an informative program, and just to be clear, that the mediator, I don't know if we've said that very clearly, but for people listening who are mediators, that you're either going to be the mediator or you're going to be the evaluator. You're not in. You can't do dual role, and that's very important that you don't cross over. So you're talking about different cases, but this
mediators are neutral.
They have to be neutral, and this is the information that be brought to them. Very interesting information. I want to thank you for joining us today on Manousso Musing, and thank you also to Mac, Pierre-Louis, and to Natalia, and certainly Dr. Leach. Thank you for being on our program today.
My pleasure.